here, I want to understand sort of the interface between biology and psychology in terms of shaping how organisms choose their mates, including how humans choose their mates. And what I'm going to do is sort of walk you through some experiments, first in non-humans that look at the possible role that culture plays in shaping mate choice, and then how genes and culture together shape mate choice, and then we'll move up to humans. This is a great quote, comes from Aristotle, so it's 2,500 years old, and if you're a psychologist, this is nothing new to you, right? There's an entire subdiscipline of psychology, social psychology, that really focuses on the way that things like imitation shape human behavior. So we know both from our own experience and from science that humans learn a tremendous amount about what we learn through imitation. We watch what other people do, and that teaches us how to do things, including maybe what makes for a good mate, what doesn't make for a good mate, and so on. But certainly it teaches us many, many things when we're very young, and even through our teenage years and up through adulthood. Imitation really plays an important role. Now, in my own area of research, the evolution of behavior, mostly in non-humans, for the most part, we've ignored this. We've ignored the whole notion that imitation is important in shaping how animals make their choices. Instead, we assume that in one way or another, through some really complex set of interactions, what gene or combinations of genes you have that get turned on or get turned off determine how you're going to make your choices. So we assume, in essence, a genetic component to the behaviors we're looking at. And for the most part, we've ignored non-genetic factors like imitation. That's beginning to change. Over the last couple of decades, people have now begun to recognize that not only does imitation and things like that play a role in non-humans, but that this role interacts with the way genes determine what happens. So it's an interesting, complicated set of culture and non-cultural and genetic things that interact to produce our own behavior. So if you, in fact, go into the literature, you will generally see this notion that imitation and social learning and other things like that's important. You'll typically see that talked about as a kind of cultural transmission of information. You learn what to do by watching others in your culture and then doing it yourself. And in fact, there are hundreds and hundreds of different specific definitions of what culture and cultural transmission is. One of the most widely accepted is this notion that cultural transmission is somehow behavior that's being spread within a population and across generations through social learning, including imitation, or teaching. This is an operational definition of culture. You can go out and you can measure how important imitation is in a population. What this means is that when you study imitation and social learning, you're studying a simple form of cultural transmission. And what I want to do to start off is just show you that people over the last couple of decades have begun to realize that we can study lots of non-human behaviors that might be culturally transmitted. And then we'll focus on whether or not choosing your mate might be one of those. And then how does that cultural side of mating interact with the genetic side of mating? Some of the earliest work in non-humans that show that cultural transmission is important were done in the context of foraging, feeding behavior. This is one of many amazing kinds of cultural transmission that we see in chimpanzee populations in the wild. What I'm going to show you here is an older chimpanzee smashing open a nut that's completely impenetrable otherwise by banging down on it with a, let's see, is she going to use a stick? She's going to use a stick. So she puts the nut there, she smashes it down, okay? She opens it up, and she eats it. Chimpanzees are completely clueless on how to do this when they're young. They have no idea how to do it. They learn it by watching older individuals, like this one, smash it open, and you will find in that population, almost everyone will open up nuts that way. But if you go to other populations where nobody has learned it at all, 0 of the individuals do it. So you have to have some individuals who act basically so that others can copy them, or you get none of it. Nobody sort of learns it on their own, except for initially. After that, everybody learns it by watching others. This is a classic kind of cultural transmission. Chimpanzees, lots of behaviors are culturally transmitted by watching older individuals when you are young. People have looked at the role of culture in other things, like figuring out what's dangerous in the environment, predator-prey interactions. So for example, in some species of birds, individuals are not born with innate fears of certain predators in their environment. Right? In some species, you learn what's dangerous by watching the way that older individuals respond to a potential danger. So you can experimentally show this. You can take an older individual and train it, for example, to be scared of something that it's not normally scared of. And if younger individuals see that, they will now be scared of that thing that's not really dangerous, but adults in the population are acting as if it's dangerous. They learn what's dangerous by watching others in their population. In other species, you do have innate fears of things, but in some species you don't, and you learn it culturally. And it's also been shown in direction finding, but I'm not going to spend any time on that. I'm going to talk to you about the work that we've been doing recently, or for the last 20 years really, on the role of cultural transmission in mate choice. And I'm going to start with a non-human system, and then we'll end with a human system. So the work in non-humans uses the guppy, Pasilia reticulata, right? You can find these in any pet store, but in nature you find them in the northern mountain ranges of Trinidad and Tobago, and that's where the fish that you're going to see come from. We know a tremendous amount about the behavior, ecology, and evolution of guppies. They are sort of the white rat of biology when it comes to studying behavior, just the way that psychologists use mice and rats over and over. People have studied the guppy many, many times, and in their natural system. So they're a wonderful, wonderful model to use for this sort of thing. They live in groups, and if you're going to study the cultural transmission of behavior, you want to work with something that lives in groups so that behaviors can spread to others. They live in clear water. That's a good one because they're almost completely visually oriented animals, just like us. And so you don't want to use something for this kind of experiment where they rely on odor and that sort of thing. It's interesting, but it's not as good for sort of shifting to, for example, to human mate choice later. Guppies are very, very visual, so what they do is very similar in terms of using vision to get cues as it is in humans and in other mammals as well. And it's really easy to bring them into the laboratory and to set up experiments. Very, very easy. You'll see as we go through these experiments how easy it is to create an experiment that has 6 different treatments and manipulate it in any way you want. Because they're small, you know, they're only, I guess they're about 2.5 centimeters, 2 centimeters long. They take to the laboratory very, very well. They don't require a lot of care. Right? And we also know a lot about the genetics of guppy mate choice, because what I want to do is first understand how cultural transmission plays a role in this system, and then I want to see the way that culture and genes interact. This is a good system because people have been studying the genetics of guppy mate choice for a long time. We know more about the genetics of how guppies choose mates than anybody should know. And so we can use that when we get to the next stage of the experiment. So here is the way these experiments work. They all are in this extremely, extremely simple setup. Okay? In the center here, I have 2 female fish. One of them is in this big canister, and there's another one over here. And then in two side chambers, over here and on the other side, I have males. And the males you can tell because they have colors, and the females don't. Okay? So I've got male 1 and male 2 on the two sides, and I want to see which male is preferred as a possible mate. Right? And I want to test that in the fish, the female that's in that circular canister in the middle. I want to see who she likes, male 1 or male 2. And what I'm going to do is, before I start a trial, I'm going to flip a coin. And if it comes up one way, I'm going to take another female, and I'm going to put her next to male 2, like you see there. Then male 2 will start courting that other female, because they're right up against each other. And male 1's going to be all by himself on the other side. If the coin came up the other way, I would have taken the male, and I would have taken that second female that's next to the male over here, I would have put her near male 1. So I randomly choose which of the males is going to have another female near it. And then I see whether the female in the middle, in the canister, prefers the male that was next to that second female. I wish I had, my pointer isn't working here. Does anybody have a pointer that's not attached to one of these? Okay, well then I'll just have to point with my fingers, okay? So again, the idea is, if I let this female in the middle observe one of the males courting with a second female, and I'm going to call that second female over here, I'm going to call her the model. She's the one that's being watched. The observer is the one I'm taking data on in a minute. But she's going to see one of the males, in this case male 2, courting with another female, and male 1 by himself. And then I'm going to see whether or not that affects her choice of which male she wants as a potential mate. So I'm going to remove everything that was in the middle, and now you're seeing that female who was in the middle canister by herself after she's observed this, and I'm going to ask who it is that she spends her time near. I'm going to use the amount of time that she spends near a male as a measure of her sexual preference for that male. And here's why I'm going to do that. We have done experiments where we take all 3 of these fish right here, right, and we just let them swim around all together and see who the female mates with. And it turns out that there's a very, very tight correlation between who she mates with there and who she spent most of her time with in this kind of setup. It's a very, very good indication of who they really do mate with. The reason that we do this setup, instead of just letting them all swim around together to see who she likes and mates with, is because as soon as you let them all swim around together, then male-male competition can really become confounding here. We don't want the males to be fighting with each other or physically forcing the female to mate. We want this to be on the female's part. So given that this time that she spends near a male is a very good indicator of who she really mates with, this is a much cleaner way to do the experiment. So we just see, who does she spend her time with? So this was the one that was observing, and we just ask, who does she spend her time with? If you run this 20 times using new fish every time, okay, in 85% of the trials, the female that was watching preferred the male that had been near that model female 85% of the time. 85% of the time. Remembering again that which of those males happened to have the other female near him was randomly selected by me. I just flipped a coin. But if one of those males has another female near him, he becomes extremely attractive to the observer. Now, this is really consistent with the idea that the observer is picking up, is using socially transmitted information, culturally transmitted information, is affecting her preference. After she sees somebody else choose a male, that male becomes attractive, and that's who she chooses. Now, the thing about this kind of experiment is that there are a number of different possibilities besides cultural transmission that might lead to these same results. And I've got to work through those alternatives to make sure to see whether or not cultural transmission really is important. So this is consistent with cultural transmission, but it's also consistent with other things. And I want to work through those other things to see if maybe they're just as good an explanation. So let's work through some of the other experiments that were done to see if cultural transmission is really important here. Okay. One of the things we know about guppies is, like many fish, they like to swim around in groups. They like being in groups. So maybe all that was going on in the experiment that I just showed you was this. There's a female in the middle, and she's watching. And on one side, there are two fish. And on the other side, there's one fish. And then when I let her choose, she just goes over to the area a moment ago that had two fish in it. Because that's an area that's likely to have bigger group sizes. It just did 5 minutes ago. Maybe it will in the future. And they like bigger group sizes because it provides safety. If that was going on, I would get the exact same thing I just showed you, but it would have nothing to do with mating and cultural transmission. It would just be that they like to go to areas that are likely to have big group sizes because that's safe. So we ran the same experiment that I just showed you before. Again, I'm not going to keep saying this, but every one of the experiments we look at are using new animals. So we run this experiment again, except now everything's the same except there are females in those side chambers. And if all that's going on here is that the middle female in that canister who's watching, all she cares about is group size, then she should consistently choose the side female that's near the model female. Okay? Just like she would have consistently chose the male that was near the model, now she should choose the female on the side that's near the model. Not what happens. In only half the trials, if there are females in the side canisters, does the one who's watching show a preference for the female that was in a bigger group. They don't care if it's only females. Take away males, take away courtship, and the whole effect disappears. So it's not just that they like group size. All right. Here's another possibility. All right. We know a lot about mate choice in guppies. There have been literally hundreds of experiments done on this, but we don't know everything. And maybe there's something about a male here and a female being together that observer likes, but maybe it has nothing to do with mating. Maybe there's something about having a male and a female together that makes that male attractive, even though it has nothing to do with mating and courtship. I don't know what that would be, but it's possible that it exists. Yes?
If we try to experiment where the male and female wouldn't be separated from the male, but you would actually allow them to mate with the male, and then see how the female from the canister reacts, would she still go to the male after he mated with the female? Or would she go to the single male?
We haven't done those experiments, but other people have, and sperm depletion is not a problem in this system. There's plenty of sperm for that male to produce, to mate with another one. But let me actually walk through the other experiments because it might address the same question in terms of what's going on here. So let me walk through them, and then if it still doesn't, we can come back to it. So what I was going to say is, okay, so maybe there's something outside the context of mating that's important here about having a male and a female together. And I don't know what it is, but maybe it exists. So here's what we did. We ran the same experiment using new animals again. But now, in between the side canister here and this side canister and the middle one, these white lines are one-way mirrors. And the way that the lighting is set up in the experiment here is that the males see their images when they look into that. They do not see the females in the middle. This is kind of like, the old spy movies where you're standing there and you're shaving in the mirror and there's a spy on the other side and they're watching you. If you have a one-way mirror and you set up the glass right, you see yourself shaving. You don't see the spy standing over there, but the spy standing over there sees you because of the lighting and the one-way mirror. So in this case, what's happening is it's like the males are the ones who are shaving. They only see themselves. Oh, sorry. The The females see through those one-way mirrors as if they're glass. They're the spies. Okay? So what happens in the guppy system is that if males don't see the females, they don't court. And when the males don't court, there's nothing for the females to respond to, and there's no mating sequence at all. So by putting the one-way mirrors there, I have exactly what I had originally, except the males aren't courting. And therefore, the females, the female on your right-hand side, the model female, is not going through any courtship because the male isn't courting her. So the observer is seeing a male and a female together. I've just removed courtship from the experiment. When you do that, the whole effect falls apart. If you have a male and a female on one side, but you remove courtship, that male is no longer preferred. In statistically speaking, in a little less than half of the trials. So it's not just that there's something about a male and a female together, it's something about courtship and a male and a female together. All right. So continuing with thinking about, okay, is this cultural transmission or is there something simpler going on that I'm missing? Because cultural transmission is notoriously difficult to demonstrate in non-humans. And you always want to make sure you run through every control experiment you can think of. So here's another possibility, okay? Think about it like this. Suppose that this is the start of my experiment, all right? Now, just for the fun of it, imagine that this observer who's watching, this observer in the middle right here, suppose she has her eyes closed and she is not watching anything, hypothetically. She's not paying attention to anything that's going on, right? Now, in this case, my male 2 was the one that was near the model. Maybe that individual is really active because just a few minutes ago it was right next to a female. And so maybe all that this observer is doing when she chooses here is just going to the fish that was swimming around a lot more because they happened to be near a model just a few moments ago. That's not really what I mean by imitating the mate choice of another individual. I'm suggesting you watch and you do what they did. Here, the possibility is you don't watch anything. There's just some correlated thing that happens later that you can use that happens to correlate with mating. And that's all they're paying attention to. That really wouldn't be the kind of imitation and mate choice I'm talking about. So I wanted to look and see whether or not that was going on. For that experiment, I ran the following control. This is the one time where you have to imagine that you're looking down into my tanks rather than from the side. So you're looking down into the tank, and now what you've got is that observer in the center circle. I sometimes call her the focal. She's the one I'm taking data on, the observer. She's sitting in her canister like usual. And there's male 2 and male 1 in their side compartments as usual. But now I've put a female in the same compartment as male 2 and another female in the same compartment as male 1. But I've put this divider up so that the focal female can only see the female that's next to male 2. And she can't see the female that's next to male 1. But male 1 can see that female. The idea here was to have the amount of courtship behavior be the same between the males, which presumably is going on here because male 2 sees a female and male 1 sees a female. So their courtship with their females presumably is about the same level. But the focal, the observer, only sees a male and female courting on, in this case, the right side with male 2. It doesn't see a female over here. When you run this experiment, again, 20 times, what you find is 85% of the time, they select the male that had been near the visible model. Again, suggesting that watching the courtship between a male and female, every part of that is necessary in order to get the results we had before. Strongly suggesting that they're learning who's a good mate through cultural transmission. Now, one last bit to this part of the experiment. If all of that's right, then there's a really simple follow-up experiment that you want to do. If it's right, that what's going on is that the observer watches and she prefers the same male as the other female. If that's right, then if I start my experiment like usual, right, and then after the observation period, I flip male 1 and male 2's side tanks. So male 2 here is the one that's been next to the model, but when male 1 when the female chooses, the observer chooses, now male 2 is over on the left side. He used to be over on the right side. If she really remembers what male other females liked and chooses that male as her own, then she should like male 2 regardless of where he is. And that's what happens. In 80% of the trials, females prefer the male that was near the model female, even when he's not where he physically was before. All right. So, and I spared you 2 or 3 other controlled experiments that we ran, but let me just say, in general, all of the controls strongly suggest that cultural transmission is going on here, that they copy the mate choice of other females. And like I said at the start of the talk, one of the reasons I like the guppy as a system here is now that we've seen that cultural transmission is important, what I want to do is look at the way that that interacts with genetic transmission. Just because cultural transmission is in play does not mean that there's no genetics or genetic transmission. It just means that there is culture. There have been dozens of experiments done on the genetics of guppy mate choice. And let me introduce you to one of the rivers in Trinidad where this experiment was done. There's this river called the Paria River. And the reason the Paria River is special is that the males in this river have some of them have very, very high amounts of orange coloration, more so than anywhere else. So if you look at this figure, if you look at that bottom male on the bottom left, he's really orange. I mean, dramatically orange. The male in the middle is not as orange, but still has orange. The male above him is, again, more dramatically orange, and so on. So some of the males in this population have tremendous amounts of orange, not like in other rivers. And John Endler and Ann Hood, who have done a lot of work on guppy mating and genetics, have demonstrated that females have an innate genetic predisposition for choosing males who have lots of orange. So now I have a population where we know that females have a genetic preference for more orange males. And I'm going to try and set up an experiment to look at how that genetic preference interacts with or doesn't interact with the cultural transmission that I just told you about. But before I do that, let me just give you one 30-second side story because it's just too cool to skip over. It has nothing to do with mating, all right? But one might ask, why is it that in this river, compared to all of the other rivers, males show this tremendous amount of orange? Some of them do. So it turns out that if you go to lots of other rivers, there are all sorts of nasty predators, fish predators and bird predators, that are very, very good at picking out the most dramatically colorful males. And in those rivers, you tend to see males have much less coloration. In the Paria River, there's only one real predator that feeds on guppies, and it's not a fish and it's not a bird. It's a prawn. It's a big prawn. The prawn is colorblind to orange. And so the males can advertise themselves to females by being very, very orange without at the same time advertising themselves to predators. So they're hiding out in the orange color spectrum. But again, for what we're going to talk about, the key here is that other people have found that females have a heritable preference, a genetic predisposition for choosing the more orange male. If you give a female the choice between a more orange and a less orange male, just a single female, 2 males, one more orange, one less orange, 90% of the time they choose the more orange male. And they do that as soon as they start making choices. And they've done all of the things you need to do a real good heritability experiment to show that that is passed down across generations. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up an experiment that looks at the role that the culture we've talked about before plays in a population where we know there's a genetically based preference for color. And I'm going to try and understand how these different transmission systems, culture and genes, interact. And the way that I'm going to do this, and I'll show you the details in a second, but the way that I'm going to do it is I'm going to show an observer female, 2 males, and I'm going to keep putting another female near the less orange of the 2 males. Right? Knowing from other work, and from work I'll talk to you about in a minute, that if it was just those 2 males, she would almost always choose the more orange. What is she going to do when I put a male near the less orange of the 2? So it's sort of like, I don't know, you must have soap operas here, right? Do you know what that term? Okay. So it's like an evolutionary soap opera. The female's in the middle, and the cultural transmission is pulling her towards one male who's less colorful, but there's another female who apparently likes to mate with that male. And on the other side is this more orange male that you have a genetic preference for, but there's nobody near. What do you do? Okay. And it's more complicated than that, but that's one way to think about it. All right. So let me show you the experiment to look at that. It has 4 different parts to it, and each one of those 4 parts has a control. So I'm just going to walk you through this, and then I'll show you all the data in about 3 minutes. Okay, so let me go back. In treatment 1, what I have are 2 males that have been matched for color, meaning that they're as closely color matched as I can get them. And that's to within about 4% orange. So they're as close in amount of orange as I can make them. In another treatment, the males differ in how much orange they have. 2 males, one of them is on average 12% more orange than the other male. In the third treatment, the 2 males differ by quite a lot of orange. One male is on average has 24% more of its body covered by orange than the other male. And then in the fourth treatment, the males are dramatically different in terms of the amount of orange. This is about as different as I could get them given the variation I had in my population. One male is on average 40% more orange than the other male. For each one of these, I run a control, and the control is really, really basic. I'm going to take a female and I'm going to put her between the 2 males, and I'm going to let her choose. So for treatment 1, that means the males are matched for orange. I'm going to see where she goes. In treatment 4, the males are dramatically different in orange. I'm going to see where she goes. Okay. Then I run it for each one of them, the experimental part. And the experimental part is that I always take a model female and I put her near the less orange male. Either he's 4% less orange, or he's 12% on average less orange, or 20% less average on average less orange, or 40% less orange on average. And just to be clear, the reason I'm doing the control, where the female just sees 2 males and I let her choose, is everything that I told you before about the heritability of the preference for orange is really well documented. But I wanted to make sure that in my population of guppies, that is in my laboratory, that they have this genetic predisposition. So I ran the control, which is essentially putting them between the 2 and seeing if I find that they very strongly prefer the more orange male if there's just 2 males. And then I introduce the experimental part where I manipulate which of the males is near a model. So what I'm going to do first is just show you one comparison, and then I'll show you all the data on one chart. So here's a case where the males differ by 12%. So they're somewhat different, but not dramatically different. If, though, you take a female and you just put her in there and you let her see male 1 and male 2, and then you let her choose, just like everything that had been done before would suggest, they strongly prefer the more orange male, even if he's just on average 12% more orange. In this case, it was 85%. In some cases, you'll see it was like 90%. Very strong preference, just like I would expect if this was an innate preference based on what other people had shown. That's the case here. So they're different by 12%, very strong preference for the less colorful one. Now, do the experimental part of this. Now they differ by 12%, but I'm consistently going to put a model near the less orange of the males. Now the preference is completely flipped. Now there's a strong preference for the less colorful individual, the one that was near the model. Again, all new animals, all of that. Now, here are all 4 cases, the treatments and the controls. So let's just walk through them. Red is the control. And all the control line shows me is the following. Look for a moment at treatments 2, 3, and 4. They're all up in the 80 to 90% range. All that's telling me is that if the males differ by any real amount of orange, 12%, 20%, or 40%, just like I would expect, females really, really like the more orange male if nothing else is going on. The y-axis is the percentage choosing the more orange. And all that the first case, the first point here, when there were 4% difference, all that's telling me is that just like I say that the males do not differ by much orange, that's the way the females see them, in the sense that if you put 2 males and they only differ by 4% on average, half the time they choose the one that's a tad more orange, and about half the time they choose the one that's a tad less orange. It doesn't have a strong effect, which is what I would expect, because I tried to match them for color. Now, here's the treatment. What I showed you a minute ago when I talked about the 12% case, that's just what we see here, which is that if there's nobody else around, you have a very strong preference for the orange male. If there's a male, the less orange male has a model near them, then all of a sudden that less orange male becomes more popular. Because again, the y-axis is the proportion choosing orange. So you see on the bottom line here that for treatment 2 here, if the 12% on average less male has a model near him, then something on the order of 80% of the females like the less orange male. They like him. Same thing happens when the males differ by a real amount, quite a bit, 24% on average, twice as much as before. Again, if you just let them choose between those 2 males and nobody else is around, overwhelmingly they like the more orange male. But if there's a model near the less orange male, again, overwhelmingly they like the less orange male, the male that was near the model. If you go to case number 4 here, you see something different, which is regardless of whether you see those males alone or you see a male who, or you see the less orange male near a model, the observer consistently likes the more orange male. One way to think about these results are like this. It's as if there's some sort of hypothetical partition between 4 and 2 and 3. For treatments 2 and 3, one way to think about this is that the cultural transmission outweighs the genetic transmission, because you consistently like more orange males, but all of a sudden, if there's somebody near the less orange male, you prefer them. That suggests the cultural input is overriding or masking the genetic preference. For treatment 4, though, it's the opposite. For treatment 4, what you're seeing is that the genetic predisposition masks or hides any cultural effect, because it doesn't matter if there's another female near the less orange male. If he's 40% less orange, you don't like him. You like the 40% more orange male. So the genetic predisposition is masking the cultural effect. Of course, this kind of figure is very specific to the guppy population that I looked at in my laboratory at that particular time. But the more interesting thing would be whether or not there's this interplay between culture and genetics, even if, where these lines would exactly be would differ across species. It seems as though culture masks genetics in some cases and genetics mask culture in another. Now, last guppy experiment. I thought, well, in a way, those experiments were unfair. in the sense that what I was really manipulating was color, right? I manipulated how different the males were in color, and then I either had them by themselves or I had them with a female. But I didn't manipulate the strength of culture. And what I mean by that is every treatment either had no female or one female model, no models or one model. So either you looked alone, you looked at the males alone, or you looked and there was a female near one of the two males. So I thought, what would happen if the amount of culturally transmitted information was higher than that, was greater than that? Could I make a male that was typically not preferred all of a sudden preferred if the cultural transmission really, really strongly suggested that lots of other individuals preferred this male? So let me show you what we did. Up through here is exactly what you just saw a moment ago. And I added now a fifth case. And in the fifth case, the males, again, were dramatically different in orange, 40% on average. But now, instead of just showing the observer the less orange male near a model, I showed her the less orange male near a model. I then waited a minute, and then I showed her yet another female prefer the less orange male. So she has the experience of seeing not one, but two other females prefer this less orange, very, very drab male. Could I make those poor, very, very drab males all of a sudden attractive if the cultural transmission strongly suggested that lots of others in the population liked that kind of male? And what you find is that the control did not vary very much, statistically vary at all. Okay? But look at the black line, the treatment. Now, about 60% of the females preferred the less orange male. The male that normally, if he was just with another male, would have no chance. The male that if one female was near him would still have no chance. But now, if a series of females show interest in him, all of a sudden, that male becomes attractive. All right, so now let me finish up with about 10 minutes on human mate choice, all right? But let me just set this up by telling you the way that this usually works when you study animal behavior, meaning non-human behavior. Typically what happens when you do the kind of work I do is you don't usually get invited to parties, but if you do and you get to go to a party and someone comes up to you and asks you what you do, you tell them, oh, you know, I am studying the evolution of mate choice and cultural and genetic transmission. And they'll ask you in what, and you'll say guppies, and then the first question will be, well, what does this tell us about human behavior? And the normal response is you give them this sort of very general hypothetical answer about how, well, the more that we understand what's going on across many, many different species, the more that sheds light on our general understanding of the pattern, including the pattern in humans, and then, you know, you go and, you know, you leave and you know, don't get invited to any more parties for a while, and then the same thing happens again. But in this case, what happened was I was lucky enough that in my university, on the same floor that I was, we shared the floor with psychology, and I gave a talk over in the psychology department. It turns out one of the people that works over there studies human mate choice. And we talked after I gave my presentation, and to my amazement, nobody had ever studied experimentally the role of imitation in human mate choice. And this was about 15 years ago. Okay. Now, that is true despite the fact that we all know it's extraordinarily important. Despite the fact that we all went to high school and when we were 15 and 16 years old experienced the fact that all of a sudden, if lots of people from your sex find somebody else attractive, you seem to find them attractive. Culture plays a huge role. We know the advertising industry knows this is critical. Why do you think they keep showing you certain things that they want you to imitate, what they want you to mimic? We know this is crucial, and we know it's really crucial in terms of what you find attractive, yet nobody at that point had done an experiment on the role of imitation, copying in human mate choice. So we thought, let's do this experiment, and we're going to do it in a way that we're going to try and make it general enough that we can make some comparisons between humans and non-humans. Okay, so I'm going to show you one study, and this study was done as a survey study, which means that we had people come into the laboratory, they read a scenario on paper, and then we asked them to answer a bunch of questions. Okay? Now, we recently finished an experiment where we ran the same sort of thing, where we hired actors from the acting school at our university to actually play out the roles that you're going to see in our scenarios, and we get the same general results. But I'm going to show you the scenario one because we've worked through the data on this one. And so here's the idea, okay? We had, what do we have? Like 134 subjects, 60 males, 74 females. All of them were university students, and they were all involved in an experiment. They basically, in their classes, they have to sign up for a number of experiments to get credit for their class, and this is how social psychologists get data. And it's not my fault that they do it this way, and I'm not thrilled with it, but so it's okay, so this is a university population with all the things that come along with the university population, but that's the data we have. Okay, so, and the average age was a little higher than you might expect. About 21 was the age of our subjects. And in this case, we were looking at mate choice both in males and females. So in the guppy case, we only looked at choice of mates in females. And there's a good reason that we did this, and this is typically what people do who study animal behavior. We tend to focus on female mate choice rather than male mate choice. The reason you focus on female guppies choosing between males is because females do show some preferences. They like certain males over others. If you look at male preferences, male guppies will mate with anything that moves, and so you don't get any variation. Now, I'm not going to get into, but in humans, it's not quite that bad, and so we thought we could look at both male mate choice and female mate choice. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to show you what would happen if you were a subject in this experiment, what you would see, and then what kind of questions you would be asked, and we'll look at the results. Okay. So all right. So now I'm saying, suppose that you're a female coming into our study, right? You sit down, and first we ask you many, probably a couple of hundred general questions about yourself and your attitudes, and we make sure that you're not in there just to mess around and screw up our experiment. And as soon as we're satisfied that that's true, we let you read the survey that's really the experiment here. So you're a female, you come in, you read this. Chris is some man. And you're told Chris was interviewed independently by five women. And every interview lasted 20 minutes, and the interviewer could ask anything that she wanted. Okay, so there were 5 women. They each talked with Chris for 20 minutes. They could ask Chris anything they wanted, and then those 5 women were asked to assess Chris, and you're going to read about what they said. Okay, and so you're going to be told that in terms of physical attractiveness, poor Chris only rated 3 out of 10. All right? And you're also going to be told that the 5 women, they were asked how interested they would be in dating Chris. And Chris actually had 4 of the 5 women say that they would date him. So you're given 2 pieces of information, and only 2 pieces of information. What others thought about Chris's physical attractiveness, and how many of the individuals were willing to go out with Chris. Okay, now, if you're a male and you come to the experiment, you're given the equivalent. It was done for heterosexual preference. So if you're a male, you come in and you're told that Chris, who now is a woman, because Chris could be either a male name or a female name. So you're told there's this woman, Chris, that she was interviewed by 5 other guys, and they could ask anything they want, and you're given the same general information. So we could get the exact same kind of information from both our male subjects and our female subjects. Furthermore, sometimes Chris would have a low physical attractiveness like this, or sometimes Chris might have a high physical attractiveness. Or sometimes lots of women would want to go out with Chris, or lots of men would want to go out with Chris, and sometimes instead of 4 out of 5, it might be 1 out of 5. But here's the thing. There's no Chris. And there are no 5 women who interviewed Chris. We made it up. And we were given permission to make it up by the university. And the idea is that we can now manipulate this, right? So what we could do is we could have all combinations of information about Chris. We could have a combination like this in which Chris wasn't particularly physically attractive, but lots of people wanted to go out with him, right? We could have super Chris, who was both physically attractive and everybody wanted to go out with him. Or we could have Chris who was unattractive and nobody wanted to go out with him, and whatever the last combination was. And we could do that both for males and females. So we could experimentally manipulate these things and see what effect it had. And our idea was that this second bit of information is the key cultural transmission information. How many other people would date Chris if they could? Right. The physical attractiveness one, lots and lots and lots of data suggests that physical attractiveness, we might have genetic preferences for physically attractive people, so we didn't think of this as particularly a culturally transmitted thing. But let's just see what the data say. Okay, so you read all of this, and then we ask you a bunch of questions after you've learned about Chris and all that we tell you about Chris. But again, the only thing we tell you is physical attractiveness and who wants to date Chris. So we say to you, okay, just given that bit of information, tell us on a scale of 1 to 7 how interested you would be in dating Chris. Then we ask you, how good do you think Chris's social skills are? And again, we told you nothing about that. Then we ask, and you rank. Then we ask you, how good do you think Chris's sense of humor is? And you again rank it, right? And let me go back. Sorry. We ask you, how wealthy do you think Chris is? And you give us information about that. The reason we ask about sense of humor is that sense of humor, lots of other studies have shown that sense of humor is really important in human mate choice. So we ask you all these questions, right? And then we analyze the data. And the reason, so one nice thing about this experiment compared to the Guppy experiment is that we can begin to figure out what you attribute to somebody when you see lots of other individuals have a preference for them. What I mean here is this. When it comes to the Guppies, all we can really ask is, who do they prefer? Who do they mate with? Who do they spend their time with, right? We have no idea inside the Guppy brain what's going on such that a male who would normally be unattractive is all of a sudden considered attractive because lots of other females like him. We don't know what attributes you now associate with a male because lots of other individuals interacted with him. But we can ask those questions in humans, because questions 2, 3, and 4, you know nothing about that. Any answer you give us there is your assessment of how that two little bits of information we gave you must translate into social skills or humor or money. You don't know, but we're asking you, what do you think is the case? All right. So, first we began to analyze things individually. And you find, if you just look at physical attractiveness and you statistically remove everything else, if more people said Chris was attractive, our subjects were more likely to date Chris. Stunning, isn't it? So this is something that everybody knew already. Right? If you just analyze that and you hold everything else constant, people weigh physical attractiveness. And that was true for both males and females. That is not unbelievably unexpected, but it's certainly something that's found over and over again for males, and sometimes for females, but not always. But in our case, it was for both males and females. All right. Now we said, if we just look at the dating variable alone, isolated, statistically removed from the other factors, what happens? And what you see here is a strong cultural transmission copying effect. The more individuals who said they would date Chris, the more likely our subject was to date Chris. So you are more likely to imitate the choice of others than you are to ignore that information. But there's an interesting interaction. And the interaction is that the effect was stronger in females. So it existed in males, but it was stronger in females. And in particular, follow-up statistical analysis found that both males and females would copy the mate choice of others. But it was very, very difficult in the case of males to get them to be interested in dating someone if that person had a low physical attractiveness variable. It was very hard to get them to be dateable. It was possible, but it was much, much harder to bring them up to dateable than it was for females. So females relied more strongly on cultural transmission, which from an evolutionary perspective makes some sense, because mistakes in males are not nearly as dangerous as mistakes in females. Politically correct or not, it's true that males don't get pregnant and females do. And so one would think that females would be more inclined to use all the information that they could get about a male, more so than males would. Not that males don't, but just that the effect is stronger in females than it is in males. Interestingly, both males and females said that if lots of people would date Chris, Chris likely had good social skills. They also thought that if lots of people were willing to date Chris, that he had a good sense of humor or that she had a good sense of humor. So both of these things were true for both male and female subjects. For both males and females, they assumed that if lots of people were dating Chris, that Chris was wealthy. Like we saw a moment ago, that effect was in fact stronger for females than it was for males. This, from an evolutionary perspective, it's not surprising for the following reason. Back in the late 1980s, an evolutionary psychologist by the name of David Buss did a classic experiment. And what Buss did was he got data from 36 or 38 different cultures around the world on male and female preferences for mates. And what you find is when it comes to asking how important wealth, money, resources is in a potential mate, I believe it was something like 36 out of the 37 cultures, it was more important to females than it was to males. Now that could be for a whole suite of cultural reasons, but that's what the data say. What we're seeing here is that effect is so strong that you're more likely to assume that someone's wealthy if you're a female, if lots of other people are willing to date them, than you are if you're a male in the same scenario. It affects you if you're a male, but it doesn't affect you as strongly if you're a male. So before I wrap up, let me just tell you that we ran one follow-up experiment, but I don't believe I have the slide up here, but it's worth telling you about. So from an evolutionary perspective, the argument would be that the reason that both males and females care about wealth and associate wealth with why individuals are attractive to the opposite sex would be that, wealth allows you to potentially have the resources to raise your family up in a good way, right? So you want to look for individuals who are capable of bringing in resources so that when you have offspring with them, you will have resources to raise up your offspring. So that sort of made us think, okay, we were actually quite vague about wealth here. All we just did was we asked people if wealth mattered, and it did. Right, for males and females, but a little more strongly for females. But then we thought, okay, let's run a follow-up experiment, because some kinds of wealth provide good information and other kinds of wealth do not. Right? And so we thought, okay, we ran an experiment and we had one variable that we manipulated, and that was this. In one part of the experiment, everybody was told something about the wealth of Chris. So we actually told people about Chris's wealth. In one case, what we did was we told them that Chris, male or female, whatever, in the experiment, Chris made, a quick conversion rate of kuna into dollars. So let's say, 600,000 kuna per year, right? Or 1,200,000 per year. So, you know, a very nice salary. Am I doing that right? That's about $100,000, $200,000. A very nice salary. Okay? In another treatment, we told them that, and I got the currency right, didn't I? Okay. In the other experiment, we told them that Chris was also wealthy, but they got 1.2 million from winning the lottery. Right? Now, those are two very different kinds of information. The salary that someone makes actually tells you a tremendous amount. It not only tells you about their ability to pull in resources, but it tells you about their talents and their long-term ability to pull in resources. The same amount of money that you win in the lottery tells you absolutely nothing except that that person was lucky once in their life and they have a good pool of money. It's the same amount of money, at least in the short term, as the other case, but it's due to pure luck. When you do that, people are much more strongly weigh the salary, the high salary versus the same equivalent amount of money when in a lottery. Again, suggesting that it really is sort of the underlying evolutionary logic here is right. If the evolutionary logic was wrong, then you really wouldn't care. You just simply want the money. But here, it's a signal of something important. So in humans, what we know is that this cultural transmission is important in terms of choosing mates, that it's important in males and females, that it tends to be more important in females. What we haven't done, and what I'll end with, is what you'd like to do ideally is run the equivalent of the cultural transmission and genetic transmission experiment that we did in guppies in humans. That is very difficult, but there are sort of ways in the long run that you could do that. For example, there's a lot of data, I would say it's pretty good but not great data that suggests that humans really like symmetrical faces in the opposite sex or in their sexual partner. You like symmetrical faces, meaning faces that are the same on the left and right. And there's sort of a good evolutionary logic about why that might be. But we seem to have a very strong preference for this. There's some indication that that is due to underlying genetic variants. That is, that there's a genetic component to preferring more symmetrical faces. Again, I'm being a little bit cautious here because I don't know that the data is extremely strong, but there's hints of it. What you could do in the long run is an experiment where you manipulated facial symmetry and culturally transmitted information. So you could go online right now, and there's all kinds of already pre-made software that allows you to take the same face and manipulate the symmetry of it online. So you can put in your face or anybody's face as long as it's the right taken from the right angle, and you can manipulate the face to make it more or less symmetric. So we could do that in the laboratory. We could take those faces in pictures, and we could do the equivalent of this survey where we tell people, okay, here's a picture of Chris, and we could make Chris either very symmetric in terms of the face or less symmetric, and then we could give individuals information about the cultural transmission, that is how many other people said they would date Chris, and so on. You could also, it would be very hard, but you might actually be able to take a given actor and by using makeup and clothing and so on, actually manipulate the facial asymmetry artificially, and so that you could actually do the equivalent of an experiment with actors. And again, but the idea is you could look at that being your proxy for genetic transmission, and you could give them information culturally, or you could let them see or interact with people culturally, and you could potentially do the same sort of experiment in humans. We haven't gotten there yet, but I had enough trouble. It was difficult to do the first set of experiments, but one could do those, and in the long run, you could get at these things. Nowadays, there's more and more information from non-humans about the interaction of genes and culture. It's still new, the last 10 years, I would say, in terms of the mating preferences, but we're moving in that direction. So I should stop now and take some questions, and I appreciate you staying so long. I really do.